The morning started like any other Tuesday for the construction crew working along the old mountain highway. Dense fog hung low over the hills and the air carried that crisp bite that only October mornings can deliver. Nobody expected this to be anything more than another routine day of clearing debris and moving earth. The landslide had happened 3 weeks earlier, triggered by unusually heavy rainfall that had battered the region for days. Tons of mud, rocks, and uprooted trees had come crashing down the mountainside, completely blocking what used to be the main road through these parts. Though the highway had been mostly abandoned years ago when the new interstate opened up, the local authorities still wanted it cleared. Hikers used the area, and emergency vehicles needed access to the old trails. The crew foreman had assigned his most experienced excavator operator to handle the heavy lifting. This wasn't his first rodeo with landslides. He'd been doing this kind of work for nearly 15 years, and he knew the mountains like the back of his hand. The big yellow excavator rumbled to life just after dawn, its diesel engine echoing through the quiet valley below. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. The massive metal bucket scooped up load after load of mud-caked debris, depositing it into waiting dump trucks. Tree branches, boulders, and compressed earth moved steadily out of the way. The operator worked methodically, carefully checking the stability of the slope above before taking each new bite out of the debris pile. Around mid-morning, something changed. As the excavator's bucket tore through another section of compacted mud, there was an unexpected metallic scraping sound. The operator had heard plenty of things get caught in landslides over the years. Shopping carts, old road signs, pieces of fence, even the occasional abandoned farm equipment. But this sounded different, heavier, more substantial. He stopped the machine immediately and climbed down from the cab. The other crew members noticed him waving and made their way over, their boots squelching through the muddy terrain. Everyone gathered around the excavator bucket, peering at what looked like a curved piece of rusted metal protruding from the mud. At first, nobody could quite make out what it was. One worker thought it might be part of an old water tank. Another suggested it could be debris from a barn that used to stand somewhere up the mountain. But as they carefully brushed away some of the caked-on mud with their gloved hands, the truth began to reveal itself in a way that made everyone's blood run cold. It was a car. Or at least what remained of one. The crew stood there in stunned silence, processing what they were looking at. The vehicle was completely encased in hardened mud and debris, like something preserved in amber. Only a small section of the roof and what appeared to be part of the driver's side door were visible, but it was unmistakably a sedan. The rust suggested it had been buried for a very long time. The foreman pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed the local sheriff's office. His voice was steady but urgent as he explained the situation. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars came winding up the old mountain road, their lights flashing against the gray morning sky. The deputies approached the site carefully, their expressions growing more serious with each step. One of them, a veteran officer who'd worked in these mountains for decades, knelt beside the partially exposed vehicle. He used his flashlight to peer into the gaps between the mud and metal, though visibility was extremely limited. What happened next would be talked about in the town for years to come. The officer asked one of the construction workers if they could carefully clear a bit more debris from around what looked like the rear of the vehicle. The excavator operator, now working with extreme caution, made small, precise movements with his bucket. Inch by inch, more of the car emerged from its earthen tomb, and then they saw it. A license plate so corroded and mud-stained that the numbers were barely legible. But they were there. One of the deputies took several photos with his phone, trying different angles to capture the faded digits and letters. He then radioed back to headquarters, reading off what he could make out of the plate number. The response came back faster than anyone expected. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio with information that sent a chill through everyone present. The vehicle registration matched a car that had been reported missing over 2 decades ago. Not stolen, missing, along with the family that had been inside it. The construction site, which had been filled with the noise of machinery and casual conversation just an hour earlier, fell into an eerie quiet. Everyone present understood they were standing at what had suddenly become something much more than a routine cleanup job. This was now a recovery site, a place where answers to very old questions were about to emerge from the earth itself. The officer in charge immediately called for backup and specialized units. Crime scene investigators would need to be brought in. The coroner's office would need to be notified. And someone would need to start pulling files from a case that had gone cold long ago, gathering dust in some basement archive. As more law enforcement arrived, the construction crew was asked to step back from the immediate area. Yellow tape began going up, marking off the perimeter. The workers stood at a distance, watching as their routine Tuesday transformed into something none of them would ever forget. Some called their families. Others just stood there, trying to process what they'd stumbled upon. The excavator operator sat on the bumper of his truck, his hands still trembling slightly. In all his years of moving earth and clearing debris, he'd found many strange things buried in these mountains. But never anything like this. Never something that connected to real people, real lives, and real tragedy. As the fog began to lift and the October sun climbed higher in the sky, more officials continued to arrive. Investigators carrying cases of equipment, officials with clipboards and cameras. The old mountain highway, which had seen so little traffic in recent years, was now lined with vehicles. And buried in the mud, still partially hidden but no longer lost, a vehicle waited to tell its story. A story that had begun 22 years earlier and had remained hidden until a rainy season. A landslide and a routine construction job finally brought it back to light. The mystery that had haunted a small mountain community for over 2 decades was about to be solved. But first, the painstaking work of excavation and investigation would need to begin. The detective who caught the case had been with the department for nearly 12 years, but she'd never worked anything quite like this. When the call came through about the discovered vehicle, she was finishing up paperwork on a burglary case. Within minutes, she was in her car, racing toward the old mountain highway with a knot forming in her stomach. She'd heard stories about the missing family. Every cop in the region had. It was one of those cases that got passed down through the department like a ghost story, the kind of mystery that made even seasoned investigators lie awake at night, turning theories over and over in their minds. And now, after all these years, there might finally be answers. As she drove, she pulled up the case file on her laptop mounted in the passenger seat. The database loaded slowly, the system struggling with files that hadn't been accessed in years. When the information finally appeared on screen, she had to pull over for a moment just to read through it properly. The family had disappeared on September 15, 2001. A Saturday evening. They'd been returning home from a camping trip in the mountains, something they did several times each summer. The father worked as a high school teacher. The mother ran a small bookstore in town. They had 2 daughters, ages 7 and 4 at the time. By all accounts, they were a normal, happy family who loved spending time together outdoors. When they didn't return home by Sunday morning, friends started to worry. By Sunday evening, the grandmother had called the police. The family's camping gear was found at their usual spot by the lake, neatly packed and loaded into their car, suggesting they'd left the campground as planned. But somewhere between the lake and their home, just 23 miles away, they had vanished completely. The detective continued reading as she sat in her parked car, the engine still running. The initial investigation had been massive. Search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the mountains. Divers searched the lake. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the forest, calling out names that would never be answered. The case had made national news for a brief time. The media loved a mystery, especially one involving a wholesome family who seemed to have evaporated into thin air. Theories multiplied like wildfire. Some people thought they'd run away to start a new life, though nobody could explain why they would abandon their entire extended family without a word. Others suspected foul play, perhaps someone who'd followed them from the campground. The most painful theory, the one the grandmother had clung to for years, was that they'd somehow gotten lost and were waiting to be found. Even years later, she would call the sheriff's office whenever there was a storm or a landslide, begging them to search new areas that might have become exposed. Most people in town thought she was in denial, unable to accept that her daughter and grandchildren were probably gone forever. The detective shook her head as she read through witness statements. Questioned. Other campers who'd been at the lake that weekend. Gas station attendants along the possible routes home. Workers at the small country store where the family usually stopped for ice cream on their way back from trips. Nobody had seen anything unusual. Nobody had seen the family at all that day. She scrolled through pages of investigation notes, each one representing hours of work by dedicated officers who'd tried everything they could think of. The father's finances had been thoroughly examined, looking for any sign of planning or unusual activity. Nothing. The mother's phone records showed only typical calls to family and friends. The couple's friends and co-workers all insisted they seemed happy and stable. As months turned into years, the case went cold. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because there were simply no more leads to follow. The file was officially listed as a missing persons case, updated periodically but essentially dormant. The family's house had eventually been sold by relatives. The bookstore closed down. Life moved on for everyone except those who'd loved them. Now, sitting in her car on the side of the road, the detective realized that all those years of speculation and theories might have been based on a tragically simple truth. Sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes people don't vanish because of complicated conspiracies or careful planning. Sometimes they're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. She put the car back in gear and continued toward the site. When she arrived, the scene was controlled chaos. More investigators had arrived, along with equipment for a proper excavation. The county coroner was there, standing off to the side and speaking quietly with other officials. Everyone wore the same expression, a mixture of professional focus and deep sadness. The senior officer who'd first responded briefed her on what they knew so far. The license plate number was a definite match. The make and model of the partially visible vehicle appeared consistent with what the family had been driving. The location, while not on the main route they would have taken, wasn't far from one of the alternate roads through the mountains. What made everything click into place was the date. The detective pulled up weather records from September 2001 on her phone. Her heart sank as she read the reports. That entire weekend had been hit by an unusual storm system. Heavy rainfall had triggered multiple landslides throughout the region. She remembered it now, though she'd been young at the time. The storm had made local news. Several roads had been closed. There'd been property damage across the county. She pulled up the specific reports for September 15th. The day the family disappeared, the old highway they were standing on now had been one of the roads affected by landslides that day. In fact, there were multiple incident reports filed about debris and mud blocking various sections of the route. Emergency services had been stretched thin, responding to calls all over the county. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly fit together in a way that was both relieving and heartbreaking. The family hadn't been kidnapped or murdered. They hadn't run away or gotten lost in the woods. They'd simply been driving home on their usual route when nature had turned violent. A wall of mud and debris had likely come down the mountainside without warning, sweeping their car off the road and burying it instantly. The detective walked closer to the excavation site, watching as specialists carefully worked to expose more of the vehicle. She thought about all the searches that had been conducted over the years. Teams had looked everywhere except here, because this section of road had been considered too dangerous to search properly after the landslides. The irony was crushing. She thought about the grandmother who'd never stopped hoping, about the father's brother who'd spent years searching for answers, about the small community that had lived with this mystery for more than 2 decades, never knowing that the answer was here all along, buried under tons of earth just miles from where everyone had last seen them. As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the excavation site, the detective made the calls she'd been dreading. The family members would need to be notified. After 22 years of not knowing, they would finally have answers. Not the answers anyone had hoped for, but answers nonetheless. The old mountain had kept its secret well. But now, through a combination of autumn rains, shifting earth, and a routine construction job, it was finally ready to let go. The excavation work began the next morning, under a sky that threatened rain. Nobody wanted another storm to complicate things, but the forecast wasn't promising. The team of forensic specialists arrived before sunrise, setting up lights and equipment around the site. This wasn't going to be a quick process. Every step had to be documented, every piece of evidence carefully preserved. The lead forensic investigator gathered everyone for a briefing before work started. He'd done this kind of recovery before, though never with a case this old. His instructions were clear. They would work slowly and methodically. The vehicle had been buried for over 2 decades, and rushing could destroy crucial evidence or damage what they were trying to recover. The first challenge was figuring out exactly how the car was positioned. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was brought in, scanning the area around the partially exposed vehicle. The results showed that the sedan was tilted at a steep angle, nose down, as if it had been sliding or tumbling when the landslide caught it. Several feet of compacted earth and rock surrounded it on all sides. A structural engineer examined the slope above the site. His concern was obvious. The hillside was still unstable even after all these years. One wrong move, one heavy rain, and they could trigger another slide. Safety barriers were erected, and a plan was developed to shore up the slope while they worked. The excavation proceeded inch by inch. Workers used small tools, brushes, and even their hands to clear debris from around the vehicle. It was painstaking work, the kind that tested everyone's patience. But nobody complained. Everyone understood the importance of what they were doing. By the second day, more of the car had been exposed. The windshield was completely shattered, filled with compacted mud. The roof showed significant damage, dented and compressed by the weight of earth that had buried it. The driver's side was crushed inward, suggesting the impact had been severe. As they worked, the forensic team made careful observations. The position of the vehicle told its own story. It had clearly left the road with considerable force, probably carried by the initial wave of the landslide rather than simply sliding off. The way it was buried suggested the mud and debris had come down fast, engulfing everything in its path within seconds. Historical records were pulled from the county archives. Engineers reviewed old maps and incident reports from September 2001. What they discovered painted a clearer picture of that fatal day. The storm that weekend hadn't just caused one or two landslides. It had triggered dozens across the region, many happening almost simultaneously as the saturated hillsides gave way. One report stood out. A maintenance worker had called in a landslide on this exact stretch of road at approximately 6:30 in the evening on September 15th. By the time emergency crews could respond, the entire section was deemed too dangerous to approach. The decision was made to close the road permanently and route all traffic to other highways. Nobody had thought to search beneath the debris because nobody knew anyone was there. The timeline matched perfectly with when the family would have been driving home. They'd checked out of their campsite around 5 in the afternoon, according to campground records. The drive home typically took about 40 minutes. They would have been on this road right around 6:30, right when the hillside came down. By the third day, the excavation had progressed enough that investigators could see inside the vehicle through the gaps they'd carefully created. It was the moment everyone had been both working toward and dreading. The coroner was called to the site, along with additional forensic specialists who dealt specifically with these types of recoveries. What they found confirmed what everyone had already begun to suspect. The family had never left the car. The evidence suggested they'd been caught completely by surprise with no time to react or escape. The force of the landslide had been overwhelming, burying them instantly under tons of debris. In a strange way, it was the answer everyone had both feared and hoped for. There had been no suffering, no days of being lost and scared. It had been quick. The recovery process took another 2 full days. Every step was photographed and documented. Items found in the vehicle were carefully cataloged. A child's backpack, a cooler that had probably held their camping food, a camera that might have contained photos from their trip, personal belongings that had waited 22 years to be found. The forensic team worked with remarkable care and respect. These weren't just remains to be processed. These were people, a family who'd loved each other, who'd spent a happy weekend camping together, who'd been heading home to start a new school week. Everyone on site felt the weight of that responsibility. As the investigation continued, experts began reconstructing exactly what had happened. The storm had saturated the hillside above the old highway for hours. The soil, heavy with water, had reached a critical point. When it finally gave way, thousands of tons of mud, rocks, and trees had come rushing down the mountainside. The family's car had been in the wrong place at the wrong second. There would have been no warning, no rumbling or visible signs, just a wall of earth appearing out of nowhere. The vehicle had been swept off the road, tumbled down the slope, and buried under debris that hardened over time into something almost like concrete. Weather records showed that more rain had fallen in the days after the initial landslide, causing additional slides that had piled even more earth on top of the original debris. By the time the area stabilized weeks later, the car was buried under what investigators estimated to be at least 15 feet of compacted material. The reason it had never been found became painfully clear. The search efforts had focused on the main roads and the surrounding forest areas. This particular section of highway had been closed and abandoned. The massive amount of debris covering it had simply looked like part of the natural landscape after a while. Vegetation had grown over it. Rain had smoothed it down. Nature had reclaimed it completely. One of the senior investigators stood looking at the site one evening as the sun set. He'd been part of the original search team 22 years ago. He remembered walking these mountains, calling out names, hoping against hope for a response. They'd been so close, probably within a mile of where the family had been all along, but they'd never known to look here. The geological survey team provided their final assessment. The landslide that had buried the family wasn't just a random event. The old highway had been built decades earlier, cutting into the hillside without proper drainage or support structures. Over the years, water had slowly weakened the slope. The storm in 2001 had simply been the final trigger. By the end of the week, the excavation was complete. The vehicle was carefully extracted from its earthen tomb and transported to a secure facility for final processing. The site was photographed extensively, measurements taken, soil samples collected. Every detail was recorded for the official report. The old highway was quiet again, but it would never be forgotten. What had been a mystery for 22 years was now understood. Not through clever detective work or breakthrough technology, but through the simple, tragic reality that sometimes accidents happen, and sometimes nature buries the evidence so completely that it takes decades for the truth to emerge. The mountain had finally told its story. The news spread through the small mountain town faster than anyone could have anticipated. By the time the official press conference was scheduled for that afternoon, it seemed like everyone already knew. Phones had been ringing off the hook since morning. Social media was flooded with posts from people who remembered the case. The local diner was packed with folks gathering to talk, to remember, to process what they'd just learned. The sheriff stood at the podium in the town hall, facing a room full of reporters and community members. His voice was steady but emotional as he confirmed what everyone had been hearing through the grapevine. After 22 years, the missing family had been found. They'd been victims of a tragic accident, caught in a landslide that had buried them so completely that decades of searching had never uncovered the truth. In the back of the room sat the family's relatives. The mother's elderly mother, now in her 80s, sat with her hands folded in her lap. She'd waited 22 years for this moment, and now that it was here, she looked somehow both devastated and relieved. Next to her sat the father's younger brother, his eyes red from crying. They'd prepared themselves for bad news over the years, had tried to accept that their loved ones might never be found. But hearing it made official was something else entirely. The town's reaction was complex and deeply emotional. For some of the older residents, it brought back floods of memories. They remembered the massive search efforts, the community coming together to look for the missing family. Volunteers had taken time off work to join search parties. Local businesses had donated food and supplies. Everyone had wanted to help, to do something, anything to bring that family home. One retired teacher sat in her living room that afternoon, looking at an old photograph. It showed her former colleague, the father who'd taught history at the high school. He'd been beloved by his students, the kind of teacher who made learning fun and memorable. When he'd disappeared, the entire school had been in mourning. Students had written letters and drawn pictures, all saved in a box that still sat in the school's office. The bookstore that the mother had owned was long gone now, replaced by a coffee shop. But the current owner had heard all the stories from the previous landlord. Apparently, the bookstore had been a cozy place where kids could come after school to read. The mother had always kept a jar of cookies on the counter, and never minded when children spent hours browsing without buying anything. The space had felt empty for years after she disappeared. At the elementary school, teachers who'd been there long enough remembered the two little girls. The older one had just started second grade that year, excited about learning to read chapter books. The younger one had been in pre-kindergarten, still learning her colors and numbers. Their classrooms had kept their desks empty for months, hoping against hope that they'd come back. As the days passed, The community began organizing a memorial service. The local church offered its space, though it quickly became clear they'd need somewhere bigger. The high school gymnasium was opened up instead. People wanted a chance to gather, to remember, to finally say goodbye properly. The memorial was scheduled for the following Saturday. In the days leading up to it, something remarkable happened. People started sharing their memories publicly. The local newspaper created a special section where residents could submit stories and photos. The response was overwhelming. One woman wrote about how the mother had helped her struggling daughter learn to love reading, spending extra time with her at the bookstore after hours. A former student shared how the father had stayed late one evening to help him with a college application, writing a recommendation letter that had helped him get into his dream school. Neighbors remembered the sound of the little girls laughing in their backyard, playing on the swing set their father had built. The construction worker who'd made the initial discovery struggled with his own emotions. He'd found many things buried in the earth over his career, but never anything like this. Never something that connected to so much pain and so many people. He attended counseling sessions provided by his employer, trying to process what he'd experienced. His wife told him he'd wake up at night sometimes, though he never remembered the dreams. On the day of the memorial, the gymnasium was filled to capacity. People stood along the walls and sat in the aisles. Former search and rescue volunteers were there, some of them openly weeping. They'd spent weeks in those mountains 22 years ago, and many had never fully let go of the feeling that they'd somehow failed. The father's brother spoke first, his voice breaking multiple times. He talked about growing up with his older brother, about family camping trips they'd taken as kids. He thanked everyone who'd searched, who'd kept the case alive in their hearts, who'd never forgotten. He said that while the ending wasn't what anyone wanted, there was something meaningful about finally knowing the truth. The grandmother was too emotional to speak herself, but a family friend read a statement on her behalf. She wanted everyone to know that she'd never lost hope of finding answers. Even in her darkest moments, when most people had moved on, she'd kept believing that someday, somehow, she'd know what happened to her daughter and grandchildren. Now she did. And while it broke her heart all over again, it also gave her a kind of peace she hadn't felt in over 2 decades. Several former students spoke about the father's impact as a teacher. A group of women who'd been part of the Mother's Book Club shared stories about her kindness and warmth. The elementary school principal brought drawings and letters that students had made years ago, preserved all this time in the hope they'd someday be delivered. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when the search and rescue coordinator took the microphone. This man had led the original search efforts back in 2001. He'd spent countless hours in those mountains, coordinating teams, following up on leads that went nowhere. For years afterward, he'd returned to search on his own time, unable to let the case go. He stood at the podium with tears streaming down his face. He talked about the guilt that many searchers had carried, the feeling that they'd somehow missed something crucial. Now, knowing that the family had been buried under tons of debris in an area deemed too dangerous to search, he hoped his team could finally forgive themselves. They'd done everything humanly possible. Sometimes, he said, nature simply doesn't want to give up its secrets. The service ended with a moment of silence, followed by the release of balloons outside the gymnasium. Hundreds of them rose into the autumn sky, carrying messages written by community members. Children had drawn pictures. Adults had written notes of remembrance and farewell. It was the goodbye that everyone had needed but couldn't have until now. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the town. The memorial had brought people together in a way nothing had in years. The community seemed closer, more connected. People checked in on their neighbors more often. Families made sure to tell each other they loved them before leaving the house. The grandmother, despite her grief, seemed lighter somehow. She'd spent 22 years in a kind of suspended animation, unable to fully mourn because there was always a tiny chance her daughter might still be alive somewhere. Now, as painful as the truth was, she could finally begin the real work of grieving and healing. She could finally let go. The town would never forget the family that had disappeared one September evening. But now at least they knew the story. They understood what had happened. And in that understanding, painful as it was, there was finally peace. 3 months after the discovery, the state's Department of Public Safety convened a special task force. The case had raised serious questions about how missing persons investigations were conducted. particularly in areas prone to natural disasters. If a family could remain undiscovered for 22 years just miles from where they went missing, what did that say about search protocols? The task force included experienced search and rescue coordinators, geological experts, law enforcement officials, and emergency management specialists. Their mission was straightforward but crucial: figure out what went wrong and make sure it never happened again. The meetings were intense, sometimes uncomfortable, as people examined decisions made decades earlier with the benefit of hindsight. One of the first issues they tackled was the problem of searching after landslides and other natural disasters. In 2001, the focus had been almost entirely on areas that were safe and accessible. Unstable zones were marked as too dangerous and essentially written off. Nobody had seriously considered that victims might be buried in those very areas. The solution they developed was multi-layered. First, new protocols required aerial surveys using advanced imaging technology after any major landslide. Drones equipped with special sensors could detect metal and other materials buried beneath debris without putting human searchers at risk. The technology had existed for years but hadn't been standard practice in search operations. Second, they established partnerships with geological survey teams. Now, whenever someone went missing in a region that had recently experienced landslides, flooding, or other earth movements, geologists would be brought in immediately to assess where debris might have accumulated. They'd create maps showing the most likely areas where a vehicle or person could have been buried. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they changed the fundamental approach to searching unstable areas. Instead of avoiding them entirely, specialized teams would be trained and equipped to conduct careful assessments. It might take longer and require more resources, but no area would be completely written off just because it was dangerous. The changes weren't just theoretical. Within the first year of implementation, the new protocols helped locate 2 separate missing persons cases in neighboring states. Both involved vehicles that had been swept off roads during flash floods and buried under debris. In both cases, the families were found within days rather than years or decades. The new system was working, but the impact of the case went beyond official protocols. It changed how the entire community thought about safety and awareness. The local school district implemented new education programs about weather safety and natural disasters. Kids learned about the warning signs of unstable slopes and what to do if caught in severe weather while traveling. The high school, where the father had taught, established something that would become his lasting legacy. They created a scholarship fund in the family's name, specifically for students interested in studying geology, emergency management, or search and rescue operations. The response from the community was immediate and generous. Donations poured in from former students, colleagues, and people who'd never even met the family, but were moved by their story. The first scholarship was awarded the following spring. A graduating senior who'd lost her own uncle in a hiking accident years earlier received funding to study geological engineering. She spoke at the award ceremony about how the family's story had inspired her to pursue a career where she could help prevent similar tragedies. There wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. The construction worker who'd made the initial discovery struggled with what to do with his experience. He'd become something of a local figure, people recognizing him in stores and restaurants. Some days it felt like too much attention, but his wife suggested he channel his feelings into something positive. He started volunteering with the local search and rescue team, using his knowledge of the mountains and his experience with heavy equipment to help in searches. He became particularly valuable in situations involving landslides or collapsed structures. His understanding of how debris settles and shifts helped teams search more effectively. In a way, that one terrible discovery had given him a new purpose. The site itself became a place of remembrance. The old highway was never reopened. Instead, the county worked with the family's relatives to create a small memorial there. A simple stone marker was placed near where the vehicle had been found, with the family's names and dates engraved on it. Native wildflowers were planted around it, the kind that grew naturally in these mountains. People started visiting the site, especially on the anniversary of when the family went missing. It became a quiet place for reflection, not just about this particular family, but about the unpredictable nature of life itself. Hikers would stop by, leaving small stones or flowers. The memorial was never elaborate or fancy, but it felt right, peaceful, a proper resting place in the mountains the family had loved. The grandmother lived for 2 more years after the discovery. In that time, those who knew her said she seemed more at peace than she'd been in decades. She'd finally been able to properly mourn her daughter and grandchildren. She'd attended the dedication of the memorial, the establishment of the scholarship fund, and had seen the changes being made to prevent future tragedies. Before she passed, she did one final interview with the local newspaper. She wanted people to understand something important. She didn't blame the searchers who hadn't found her family. She didn't blame the authorities for closing off the dangerous areas. She didn't even blame the storm or the mountain. These things happened, she said. What mattered was that people learn from it, that something good came from something so terrible. Her words resonated throughout the region. They were quoted in training materials for search and rescue teams. They were included in the mission statement for the scholarship fund. They reminded everyone that tragedy, while painful, could become a catalyst for positive change. 5 years after the discovery, a documentary crew came to town to tell the story. They interviewed investigators, family members, the construction worker, former search and rescue volunteers, and dozens of community members. The documentary, when it aired, reached millions of people across the country. It sparked conversations about search protocols in other states and led to similar reforms nationwide. The case became a teaching example in emergency management courses at universities. Future search and rescue coordinators studied it, learning about the importance of considering all possibilities, no matter how difficult or dangerous. Geology students examined it as an example of how landslides behave and why understanding earth movement is crucial for public safety. But perhaps the most profound impact was the simplest one. In the town itself, families held each other a little tighter. People were more aware of weather warnings. Travelers were more cautious on mountain roads, especially during storms. The tragedy had made everyone more conscious of how quickly life can change, how important it is to appreciate the people you love while you have them. The old mountain still stands, of course. It's the same landscape that has watched over the valley for millions of years. But the people who live in its shadow are different now. They're more prepared, more aware, more connected to each other. They understand that nature is powerful and unpredictable, but they also know that human resilience and community support can turn even the darkest tragedy into something that helps others. The family's story didn't end with their discovery. In many ways, that's where their true legacy began, through improved safety protocols, educational programs, scholarships, and a community that refused to let their memory fade into obscurity. They continued to make a difference. They'd been found not just physically, but their story had found its purpose. And on quiet autumn evenings, when the light hits the mountains just right, visitors to the memorial sometimes pause and look up at the peaks. The wilderness is beautiful but unforgiving, yet in that harsh reality, there's also a reminder to live fully, love deeply, and never take a single moment for granted. That perhaps is the greatest lesson of all.